Well, I'll just start talking. Okay, April 9th, 1945, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Lutheran pastor, theologian, and part of the conspiracy was executed at Flossenburg concentration camp in what would be south central Germany. He was executed when you could hear the American artillery in the distance, which tells you how resentment drove Hitler. Even when all was lost, he still had to execute the conspirators. The war would be over within a month. Hitler would die, commit suicide within 2.5 weeks. Okay. Okay, how's that? That's why we have clergy professionals here. My wife, Dr. Ruth Johnson, and I have a great, why don't you come and stand with me here? A great interest in Bonhoeffer. Now I will play from start. There, that's more like it. How many of you have read Dietrich Bonhoeffer? Many of you had, I know. You're acquainted with his work. So some of this won't be new, but we just thought it's the 80th anniversary of his execution. And we thought that time should not go unobserved. It will also be the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II in Europe, and then in the summer in Japan, in the Pacific. So we think these are really important times, and there's a lot that from this era that speaks to our time, if I can be Bonhoeffer was a Lutheran pastor, a theologian, executed, as I said. He was included in the group of conspirators who were part of what's known as the 20th of July plot. You've seen the movie Valkyrie, right? The code name was Valkyrie. But he was on the periphery in a way, but his relatives were part of it as well. He was born February 4th, 1906. Dietrich, he had a twin sister, Sabina. And his parents were Dr. Karl and Paula Bonhoeffer. They were in Breslau, and he and his sister were the 6th and 7th of 8 children. Karl Bonhoeffer was a leading psychiatrist and neurologist, and in 1910 actually he came to Kaiser Wilhelm Universität in Berlin and was at Charité Hospital in Berlin. How many of you have heard of Charité? You were just there. See, it's one of the top 6, 7 medical centers in the world.
Yeah, Charité is currently ranked number 7 in the world. It's been in the top 10 for, very prominent, particularly since the end of the 19th.
So Karl Bonhoeffer was incredibly prominent in medicine, psychiatry, and neurology. He was not a religious person himself, though he was not hostile to Dietrich's aspirations. Paula, the wife, was well educated and from a family of church leaders and theologians, so there must be a gene in there somewhere. And they lived in the Grunewald district of Berlin. Can you still hear me? Which is a nice part of town. Still is. It's important to note he lost his oldest brother, who was born in 1899. He died May 30th, 1918. He'd been on the front for 2 weeks. And this was the tragedy of World War I. Both sides threw young men at it. It was idealistic. They thought it'd be over in weeks, and what happened? Went on and on and on. Bonhoeffer received his Ph.D. from Berlin University, University of Berlin in 1927, at the age of 21.
Started at 17.
He was brilliant. And he wrote a piece called Communio Sanctorum Communio, a theological study of sociology of the church. He had a dramatically new understanding of what the church was. The church, Christ was present in the body of, the gathering of the church was Christ's presence in the world. At the age of 24, 1930, he qualifies to teach at the university. He's still not old enough to be ordained a pastor.
25.
He had to be 25 to do that. So he works as kind of a temporary associate assistant pastor in various places. In you can come in here. 3031, Bonhoeffer receives a Sloan Fellowship and goes to Union Theological Seminary in New York. He takes courses from Reinhold Niebuhr, John Bailey, and other great theologians in the U.S. So the guy spoke several languages, including English, and he spent a year in New York. What happens in New York, he also becomes acquainted with the black church. And he has a friend at Union, a black preacher named Frank Fisher, who takes him to the churches in Harlem, including the Abyssinian Baptist Church, where he hears the Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Sr. Now, those of us of a certain age remember an Adam Clayton Powell Jr., right? Okay, he was rather notorious, but still a gifted preacher. So he hears, an Abyssinian Baptist Church it is a beautiful building. It was not a church that black Christians bought from white. They built it themselves and took great pride in it. It's still a huge presence in Harlem.
And Adam Clayton Powell kind of preached social justice.
Social justice.
Gospel.
And he hears music. Like, what did we have this morning? What did the choir sing? Jesus is a rock. Do you think he might have heard that at Abyssinian? Yes. And Bonhoeffer buys recordings and brings them back to Germany. And he tells his students, you gotta hear this.
And also that he never heard preaching like that before.
He had never heard preaching like that. And if you want to hear great preaching, go to in English and not Latin. Who's the great black preacher we hear? Otis. I'll not Otis Redding. But at Union, he also meets Frank Fisher, and he also meets a French pacifist named John Lasserre. And that's where he learns about pacifism and hears about Gandhi. And that work will come out in his Cost of Discipleship. That influence. Otis Moss III. Go to YouTube and look for Otis Moss III. He is an amazing preacher. Bonhoeffer returns to Germany in the summer of 31. Anything happening yet? Stirring. We've already had the inflation, right? The social and economic disruption in Germany. He does youth work in inner city churches in Berlin. Tough kids. He does actual youth work, and he is able to connect. There's a guy at Luther Seminary named Andy Ruth who's into youth and family ministry and has written on Bonhoeffer and youth work. January 30th, 1933, there had been elections. The Nazi Party, the NSDAP, Nationalsozialistische Deutsche Arbeitspartei.
Say that twice fast.
Nationalsozialistische Deutsche Arbeitspartei. That's why they shorten it to Nazi. They have close to a majority in the Reichstag, which is the parliament of a fledgling democracy in Germany. And we have to remember that. Germany had not really been a Germany until 1872. Hitler brings with him Hermann Goering. So Paul von Hindenburg appoints Hitler as chancellor. They thought they could control him. Hitler brings with him Hermann Goering as Minister of the Interior for Prussia and others. Those names ring a bell. Torchlight parades celebrate. Bonhoeffer has a radio speech shortly after that on Der Führerprinzip, the Führer principle, which had already been talked about in Germany. This antedates Hitler, the Führer principle, the leader principle. The radio speech is cut short. There's a debate as to whether the plug was pulled or whether he just ran out of time. March 23rd, 1933, the Reichstag fire. How many of you have seen the reconditioned Reichstag in Berlin? There was a Dutch communist who was arrested. It was claimed a group of communist agitators were plotting against the government. There were communist agitators. I mean, that part's not being made up. Whether he's the guy who started the fire is still up to debate. He was later pardoned by the contemporary German parliament. So March 23rd, 1933, the Enabling Act, the law to remedy the distress of the people in the Reich. And Hitler proclaimed Christianity as the foundation of German culture. Isn't that great to have Christian support like that? I say that with deep irony in my voice. And in April 1933, there is legislation reforming the civil service. I didn't say that. So the legislation refers to civil service, and so they reform who can be a civil servant, and this allows for the removal of non-Aryans from jobs in the civil service, as well as political parties, social clubs, student groups, and churches. So even non-Aryans, what does that mean? Jews. That's a code word for Jews. And so it removes Jews from life in German government, and also pastors who were of Jewish heritage, but whose family were baptized Christians and whose family had been Christians. They were included as well.
One grandparent.
That's all it took, one grandparent. Yeah. Yeah. So this includes pastors who were baptized Christians. Bonhoeffer responds to this. He writes, "The Church and the Jewish Question." He almost immediately writes this, and he is one of the first Protestant leaders to speak out on this issue. "The Church has a responsibility to question injustice," he wrote. "The Church has an obligation to help all victims of injustice, whether or not they are members of the Christian community. Do good to all men." And we would say people, right? "And the Church is obligated to put a spoke in the wheel of injustice," and by that he means disrupt, to hamper persecution. And Bonhoeffer also posed regarding Judaism as a racial category. And remember, the Hitler language is Blut, blood, race. And Bonhoeffer said this is not a race, it's a religion. Ruth, okay. 1933 also means with the Evangelische Kirche, the Evangelical Church in Germany, which is a collection of Reformed, Lutheran, and then what they called United churches that had both Lutheran and Reformed creeds in their constitutions. There were a number of Landeskirchen. Each German state had its own evangelical church. That's still true today. The Nazification of Protestant churches, and Hitler had a new election, and they appointed a Reichsbischof, Müller, to be in charge of it all. In response to that, there was the formation of the Pastors' Emergency League, Pfarrer Notbund, and one of the leaders in that was Martin Niemöller. Bonhoeffer is involved in this too. He and Niemöller are near each other. They work together. That's why we're bringing Niemöller in. So this was to avoid the question. The pastor signed a statement saying, "My allegiance is to Christ and not to the Fuhrer." And that's what drove the Pfarrer Notbund. Niemöller might be familiar to. He's the one to whom the phrase is attributed. "First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, but I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me." How many of you have heard that before? That's Martin Niemöller. That's really after the war, as he tries to deal with collective German guilt. The picture you see here is actually, it's the final exhibit in the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. speak to you? It does. Niemöller was a son of a Lutheran pastor, but he was a U-boat commander in World War I. He was not a pacifist. He's a complex figure. He's not. What's that? The U-boat is a submarine. U-boat. You've all seen Das Boot. Yeah, I think that's a World War I submarine, or is it World War II? I forgot. Das Boot. Wolfgang Petersen film. Oh, if you ever want to see a grim war film, that's it. Ruth and I were at Niemöller's. We were in Berlin in September of 22, and I'll get to that. Yeah, and we went to Niemöller's church in Dahlem. We encountered an old friend of mine who's a pastor, a retired pastor in Berlin, and he took us around to these places. And there I am standing outside of the parsonage where Niemöller was arrested. Yeah. Buried now in the church at the St. Anne's Church in Dahlem is Rudi Dutschke. Does that name ring a bell to anybody? 1968 protests. Okay. He was in prison. He was arrested in 1937 and taken to Sachsenhausen. Some of us were on a Mayo alumni tour in 2018, and we went to Sachsenhausen, which was a camp in Oranienburg, north of Berlin. It was not necessarily a death camp, but people died there. It was also a place where medical experiments were carried out.
I think one thing to mention is that Niemöller wasn't against Hitler right away.
No.
It took him a while. And so when he finally did come around, Hitler was angry, and that's why he did. He wasn't really resistant.
Yeah. Cellenbau, that means cell block, cell building. Zone Gefängnis, the special prison of the Gestapo and SS, SS Lager, SS compound, under direction of the SS. So this was a special SS Gestapo prison into which he was put. Later he was taken to Dachau.
It's hard to see, but that
This is
took
the
that
cell.
photograph when we were there, and it's the picture of Niemöller and that sort of writing that he just went through and wrote. It's
So
there.
Ruth took this picture. His cell is still identified, and that's his portrait there. And this is part of the tour group. We might see a familiar
Couple folks,
faces.
Rebecca Nessie was there, you see her sister, Deb Wilkinson is here, and Lizzie Cozine, John and Deb's daughter in front of them.
Yeah, but we just thought we'd throw that in so you see some familiar faces.
2018.
I thought I'd throw this in. 1934 is the release of a film called Triumph of the Will. Leni Riefenstahl's greatest propaganda film, in some regard it's the greatest propaganda film ever. It is the 1934 Nazi party rally in Nuremberg in September of 1934. How many of you have seen this? It's actually a must-see, though now it's taken off of YouTube because it's controversial. It needs interpretation. I show it because these are the crowds at the rallies at Nuremberg, and this is why the trials were held, the war trials were held at Nuremberg. And this is Nazi religion. See the gathering of the crowd. Again, it's a movie that one should watch. Oh, it begins. You're flying through the clouds, and how many Germans in 1934 had ever been in an airplane? Not very many. And then you realize you're in a plane that's descending, and you watch the plane descend. And who comes out of the plane when it lands? Adolf Hitler. He's descending from heaven. Oh no, I mean that is the intention. It's the messianic arrival. And so he's greeted with, as one would greet the Messiah. Bonhoeffer's in London from 1933 to 1935, where he goes to serve German parishes, German-speaking Lutheran churches in London. And that's where he meets an Anglican bishop named George Bell. Bell is a leader, he's a member of the House of Lords, and he will be a friend of the German resistance, and Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer will meet him again in Sweden in 1942. Bell is a really important player in this, and he will try to communicate what's going on with Bonhoeffer and his conspirators to the leadership of Great Britain. In 1934, there's organized the Confessing Church, the Bekennende Kirche. This is in resistance. This grows out of the Pastors' Emergency League, which is an attempt then to identify a group of churches that don't hold to reverencing the Führer. It emphasizes allegiance to Christ and not the Führer. It grows out influenced by the theology of Karl Barth, if that name rings a bell with some of you. March of 1935, many evangelical pastors read a protest statement. 700 pastors were arrested when they read that in their churches. Not all were imprisoned for long terms, but 700 were arrested. The Confessing Church, and this is where we get back to Bonhoeffer again, organized its own seminaries. Now, you went to university to study theology, but to become a pastor, you also had to go to a prediger seminar, a preacher's seminary. And that would prepare you with homiletical skills, pastoral care, things like that. And the Confessing Church had several of their own independent seminaries. One was at Finkenwalde. This is what today would be Stettin in Poland, Szczecin. And it ran from June 1935 to September of 1937. Bonhoeffer was a significant leader in this seminary. And this is where he meets Eberhard Bethge. And there was a wonderful patroness who gave them this summer home that they inhabited. Bonhoeffer with his students, I tried to if you can see my thin red line at the top. I looked carefully and I finally located him in the crowd. There were a few women who attended here as well. And he meets Eberhard Bethge, who becomes his most significant biographer. And Bethge marries his niece, Renata. Ruth and I both met Renata Bethge. You met Eberhard? Wow. So you'll have to touch us afterwards. I mean, it's just a reminder. History is not that far away. Not that far. This is the command to close Finkenwalde from the Gestapo. The Geheime Staatspolizei. You know about how Germans put words together? Geheime Staatspolizei is all one word, and so it becomes Gestapo. They continued the work in secret for at least 2 more years at parishes in eastern Pomerania, kind of out of sight and out of mind, or so they thought. Out of the experience of Finkenwalde, we get the book Life Together. I bet that's one many of you, Ruth knows it well. And that was really about shaping community. Bonhoeffer is not for an individualized Christianity. He's for Christianity as a communal, congregational, group, shared experience. You're not a Christian alone. And so they would read the Psalms and even read them during meals. Sometimes the students didn't like that. They'd rather talk. Much like students today. But again, this is a very accessible book. Am I? Okay. Ruth knows more about this than I do, so I'm happy if she steps in. The Abwehr, German military intelligence. February 1938, Abwehr lawyer Hans von Donanyi, who is Dietrich Bonhoeffer's brother-in-law, brought him into the circle of the resistance. From the early days, there had been people in this military counterintelligence unit, including a person named Admiral Canaris, who were in opposition to Hitler. They knew about the extermination camps. And those camps would really get started in 41, 42. The early exterminations, though, were of the mentally handicapped in Bethel, in Western Germany. It was part of their purification. Why should they pay to support people who were mentally incapable? And that's disturbing, isn't it? And they eventually had a list. If you had a child born with a disability, it was registered. So they had a list of children with disabilities. And they would take them from their parents. So the Abwehr was military intelligence. Admiral Canaris was the chief, and he was a resistor from the early days. Maybe they didn't like Hitler. I'm not always sure where they stood on the Jewish question, but they certainly were disturbed by the extermination camps when they come, especially get going in 41, 42. And he helped give Bonhoeffer an exemption from the draft so that Bonhoeffer could act as a courier. Bonhoeffer, many of his students at Finkenwalde were drafted. About half of them would die on the Eastern Front. Bonhoeffer couldn't qualify as a chaplain because he was already not ordained as such. And so Bonhoeffer, he was not part of the plot to kill, but he was a courier that connected the conspirators. He would meet George Bell in Sweden and Norway. He would help several Jews escape to Switzerland, ostensibly, the Abwehr said, so that they could go and spread disinformation on behalf of the Nazi regime. Of course, that's not true. They were just helping Jews escape. A handful.
So Admiral Canaris was actively recruiting.
He was, well, they had to be very careful.
Carefully.
Yeah. But Hans von Dohnen, he brought Bonhoeffer in. Bonhoeffer makes one last trip to New York in June of 1939. He stays 2 weeks and returns to Germany because he felt he needed to be there. June of 1939, the year ring a bell? September 1st, 1939, what happens? Poland's invaded. Bonhoeffer's on the last German ship to leave New York for Germany. After that, there were no more ships. He's one of the last out. Could he have stayed? Yes. He chose to return.
He had friends from the seminary that really tried to encourage him to stay.
Yeah.
He wanted him to stay here. He said, I can't help my country now or later if I don't go back.
Yeah, he said, I will be of no use afterward if I stay away. 1941, Bonhoeffer is forbidden to preach or publish. He's still protected by his connection with the Abwehr. I forgot an E and the. In 42, as I mentioned, he meets George Bell in Sweden. He conveys a message from the conspirators. They hoped for the Allies to recognize them. This was still before, there had been several assassination attempts for Hitler. The 20th of July plot in 44 is not the only one. There were several prior to that, they all failed. And they were hoping that if they succeeded, they could negotiate a peace with the Allies without going to the full extent of war. Truth be told, Churchill, who got wind of this, was not interested in negotiating peace. So they really rejected the outreach from the conspirators. Bell argued otherwise. He was in the House of Lords. He had the ear of Anthony Eden and all the people at the time. But they were not interested in making peace at this point. So they wanted to go for unconditional surrender. And they knew the disaster that was awaiting them too. January 13th, 1943, Bonhoeffer becomes engaged to Maria von Wedemeyer. She was 18, he was 36. Age gap. Maria's grandmother had been a strong supporter of the Finkenwalde Seminary, so he had known her for several years. He knew her brothers. One of her father had been killed on the Eastern Front, Remember the Eastern Front? Stalingrad and all that. They never are married. The engagement allows her to visit him in prison. She is the one who carries out some of the famous letters and papers from prison, if you know that. And she later published a book of her own letters, which is very helpful. And she came after the war, she came to the United States, studied math, became a mathematician, worked for major companies, died sadly of cancer in her 50s. April 5th, 1943, Bonhoeffer is arrested and taken to Tegel prison, which was the largest prison in Nazi Germany. He is tortured and interrogated for over a year. What do they want to know? Who's in on the plot? Do they learn from him? No. You're okay. Sadly, I'm smiling at the desk at which Bonhoeffer was arrested. So I should have looked more sad-faced.
I don't think I told him to smile. I'm not sure. This is at the home of Bonhoeffer's.
This is 43 Marienburger Allee, 43 Marienburger Allee. This is the famous home of Bonhoeffer's parents in retirement. He had retired from the University of Berlin. I think he was in his early 70s by this point, an old man. This is the room in which Bonhoeffer stayed when he was allowed to visit his parents in Berlin. For a while, he was forbidden from going back to Berlin.
Literally, as you said, arrested while sitting in front.
This is where he was arrested. The Gestapo came and found him here. He's never free again. So this is the Berliner Gedenk. This is the Bonhoeffer House, as it's known. So this is a memorial site in Berlin. There we are standing in front as proof that we were there. And my good friend, Pastor Father Kurt Kreibaum, we spent 2 hours there talking with him. He's someone I knew from 30-some years ago. It was just precious moments there at the Bonhoeffer House as we walked through the whole place, the stories, the pictures, and if you get to Berlin, this is a place you have to go. Bonhoeffer is transferred to the Gestapo headquarters. First he's at Tegel. Then in October of 44, he's transferred to the Gestapo headquarters prison in Prince Albrechtstrasse. Now this is torn down now. If you've been to Berlin, there's a museum called the Topography of Terror. And that chronicles the destruction of Jews and others in Hitler's Berlin. And that's the cell where Bonhoeffer was and tortured. This is the Gestapo's own personal jail. Pardon me. And this is where, when you came in, we were playing a song, Von guten Mächten wunderbar geborgen, by heavenly powers so graciously protected. It's a hymn that's been based on a poem by Dietrich Bonhoeffer that he wrote in December of 1944 and sent to his fiancée, Maria, and sent another copy to his parents. And this is a manuscript of the poem. One of the last writing we ever had. We play the song at home all the time. I have it in English too, but it's just so, and we find all kinds of German groups sing it. Church choirs, there's a contemporary worship music group that does it. There is a choir with orchestra. There's a group called Die Priester, 3 Catholic priests who sing, so Catholics sing it too.
Great harmony.
Great harmony. He's moved April 3rd, 1945 to Buchenwald. The gate of Buchenwald here, jedem das Seine. Anybody know what that means? To each his own. The awful things they had on their doors to these camps. What was on the gate at Auschwitz? Work makes you free. Arbeit macht frei. I mean, the cruelty even there. With the Allied artillery getting close, many of the prisoners were simply shot by the guards and left on the ground. Bonhoeffer and a few others, though, were brought to Finkenwalden. Because Hitler had a special command that anybody involved in this conspiracy had to be put to death. I mean, the whole place is collapsing, right? They hardly have gasoline to run their trucks. In fact, they carry them in a truck that runs on wood. Burning wood, right, yeah. Steam, because there's no gas. And they can hear the Americans 20 miles off. Bonhoeffer's, he's executed there, hung, and there are stories about kind of the peacefulness, I don't know if they're true, but at least about the peacefulness with which he faced death. Bonhoeffer's brother Klaus and his brother-in-law Rüdiger Schleicher were executed in Berlin on April 23rd. The Bonhoeffer family lost a son to World War I. They lost 2 sons and 2 sons-in-law in World War II to execution. There's a memorial to Bonhoeffer in Westminster Abbey. Bonhoeffer's killed April 9th. His parents don't hear about it. They're in Berlin. They don't hear about his death until they hear a memorial service broadcast on the BBC in July of 1945. That speaks to the chaos of the situation. That's when they learn. Bonhoeffer's body is never recovered. He's either burned or buried in a mass grave, so we have no physical remains. A few thoughts too. Cost of discipleship. Good. Nachfolge. Actually, the German is following after. I think that's a better word than discipleship. Following after. Nachfolge. Who are you following after? Jesus. We call them disciples, which is a terrible Latinate word. The Greek word is mathetes, students or followers. Cheap grace is the preaching of forgiveness without requiring repentance. Baptism without church discipline. Communion without confession. Absolution without pastoral confession. Cheap grace is grace without discipleship. Grace without the cross. Grace without Jesus Christ. This is the book that gives us cheap, the understanding of cheap and costly grace. And we'll close again with Niemöller's words. After the war, Germans faced a huge issue of collective guilt. And leaders like Martin Niemöller, church leaders, faced that. And there were some, the confessing church, there were some, not all Lutheran pastors, yielded or bent the knee. And so we had some people who stood up and helped rebuild, at least face the collective guilt of the nation. It's still an issue in Germany today. But, but this made it to the Holocaust Museum, first they came for. It's well worth remembering, I think. And I hear that as an admonition to me today. That's the last slide. Questions? Hat sonst noch jemand einige Fragen? Anybody else have questions? Bitte.
Derek Taxis wrote a biography of Bonhoeffer. The Bonhoeffer Society that has objections.
Yes.
What is the source of that?
The source is Eric Metaxas. The question is, Eric Metaxas wrote a very popular biography about Bonhoeffer, 15 years ago. Are you acquainted with the book?
Yes.
I have friends in the International Bonhoeffer Society. Eric Metaxas tries to make Bonhoeffer into a 21st century American evangelical. And he's not. Bonhoeffer was very much a Lutheran. He had a critique of the state Lutheran Church, but he was, Metaxas wants to make Bonhoeffer, he doesn't recognize Bonhoeffer's pacifism, and he wants to make Bonhoeffer more militant and kind of gun-toting, and he mistranslates. My friends of the Bonhoeffer Society will say to Metaxas, he doesn't have any German. That's the ultimate put down. Er kann nicht Deutsch. What's that?
Did any of you see the Bonhoeffer movie that was out this last year? Yes,
Yeah, that's
exactly
based on
what I'm saying.
Metaxas.
And Bonhoeffer's own family wrote, say, this does not represent the truth.
Yeah. That recent film, we saw it at the Marcus Theater. And I urge you to see it, but it misrepresents Bonhoeffer. And Metaxas tries to make him into an evangelical. And Bonhoeffer is not that. Bonhoeffer is not right-wing. Bonhoeffer comes out of a pietist background in many ways, in that shape. But I think it's the communitarian aspect rather than personal decision. You know, it's not he made a personal decision. He had some kind of conversion experience in New York City. That's when he says he becomes Christian. But it's not the kind of I've accepted Jesus as my personal Lord and Savior kind of thing. So I think Metaxas really twists. I've read the book. I've read Metaxas. I've read Abraham Bethke. Bethke, and Metaxas is dependent on Bethke, actually, for a lot of his stuff, and misses the point often. So does that answer your question? Yeah. Paula.
A quote that I have in my mind is that someone asked Bonhoeffer how he could be involved in this plot, or how he would act against the government. And he said he was a madman who would have values for the children on the sidewalk. And you stop it, or you stop it.
Yeah.
Happen. Now, do you know, did that happen?
I don't know. It sounds like it would fit. The quote is, how could Bonhoeffer align himself with what would be a plot? Again, he's on the periphery. He's connecting them. He's a courier, but he knows about the plot. And if you see a madman driving toward children, do you stop him or do you just watch it and let it happen? There's an essay by Luther, actually, that goes back, that gets a little quoted. Luther asks, what do you do if the coachman is drunk? So, and then German Lutherans had a problem with Romans 13, which deals with the state. Paul writes, be obedient to those in authority. And that kind of gets misinterpreted then by a lot of, shall we say, German Lutheran, German Protestant pastors. But I think that would be Bonhoeffer's rationalization for how he could be part of this. He knew a lot, but he also knew about the death camps. The Abwehr knew about Auschwitz and Dachau and Treblinka. They knew all that. And so Bonhoeffer and members of his family knew what was happening. His family was all anti-Hitler, as you can imagine. Two brothers, Bonhoeffer's brothers-in-law, all executed. So I think that's how he struggled, and this is what the Metaxas book doesn't get. Bonhoeffer really struggled personally with his involvement. It weighed on him, and he had pacifist tendencies, but he didn't declare himself a conscious objector because he thought that would harm the confessing church. So he didn't do that, make a personal decision for the sake of the greater cause. He wanted to be in alignment with the other pastors in the confessing church. So he didn't want to single himself out, though he was protected from the draft for a time by Admiral Canaris and other. Metaxas, in a preface to the 10th anniversary edition, says he wanted to rescue Bonhoeffer from the death of God hippies in academia. OMG. Yeah, there are a few of those, but I know a whole lot of parish pastors who get a lot from Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And I've got friends in the International Bonhoeffer Society, a colleague, Lori Hale at Augsburg, John Matthews in Lakeville, who's president of the English language section. These are not death of God hippies. So, I mean, that gives you the tone of Metaxas. He thinks he's rescuing Bonhoeffer from these horrible people. Paula?
That mirrors in my mind the Christian identity.
Yes.
People who try to rescue Christ from the Jewish thought that he was a weak and gentle person and he's actually a warrior.
Right, right. There is that brand of Christian nationalism which tries to portray Jesus as a warrior. I'm sorry, Ruth, I want to get... Ruth, we worked on this all together. I just want you to know. We talked about we talked
Really,
about
and we did quite a bit of work on it.
we did a lot of it, and we're a team on this. I just want to make that clear. And,
But, this whole, when I was at Augsburg, I read Cost of Discipleship, all these opportunities to think about
Bonhoeffer and all that what he did and what that's meant, and then obviously, just thinking as said, realizing this April 9th, which Phil and I have been aware of this date for a long time, but 80 years. And for 80 years, our country has started NATO and done kind of everything we can in a way with, not perfectly by any means, but to try to prevent another disaster or major world war between great powers. And for 80 years, that hasn't happened. There have been other wars here, proxy wars and other parts, but that's been there. And to see kind of how that all is at risk right now in so many ways. I mean, I have a cousin in Sweden. They iron each other back and forth, and they know everything that's going on. They know about the humiliation, the way Jimmy Vance and his wife popped into Greenland uninvited, and the whole everybody in Denmark, Norway, Sweden, they all are across Europe are so aware of everything that's going on, and just I'm trying to say, well, that's out there, but that's not where many Americans are not there at all. And I think, and we learned again more recently that Eisenhower, who'd been of course Supreme Allied Commander, in Europe, and came back, kind of finished some of his military work here, was hoping to retire, but recently, if you haven't seen it, Fareed Zakaria did a great show recently called America First, and reviewed the whole history of America First and the politics of the country from the very beginning. And are we going to just put that first, or are we going to have a bigger picture on here? And right after even after the war, there were Republican opposition to NATO, and having been the Supreme Allied Commander, Eisenhower was very committed trying to make that happen. And there was a good chance that if the other Republican leaders ran, they might have won that election in 1952. So he said, okay, not really what you wanted to do, but for the sake of the country and for the world and peace, he ran and became president. So then the Republican opposition to NATO was pushed out of the way. He had 8 years, and by 1960 it was established. But they're always just back and forth. Nothing is ever without threats and review, and it's maybe not the right thing. It's always out there. And we just thought this was so acute with what's going on in our country and how that impacts the world.
Well, Ruth said we have to recognize April 9th,
Yeah.
the 80th anniversary. So she was the one who got us started.
Well, it's
Now, this afternoon, we'll be showing a video, Martin Doblmeier's Bonhoeffer. We'll be in the sanctuary. If you aren't able to attend, there are links. You can watch it on YouTube with some wonderful commercial interruptions. But, so it's very accessible. There's another, Patty and I recommend this to Ruth, Hanged on a Twisted Cross, which is also available on YouTube. There's also a copy at the Rochester Public Library. And that is a 2-hour movie, but it really goes through the detailed timeline of things. And then we handed out many of you got a copy of the timeline from the PBS documentary 2006, which is a really good timeline. Anyway, yes, Paula.
So, what time is the movie?
4 p.m.
Okay. The other thing I wanted to ask about, I had seen a picture of a synod meeting in the 30s.
Yeah.
In Germany, and they're all in brown shirts.
Yeah.
Pastors in brown shirt uniforms,
Yes.
doing the Heil.
Yeah.
And, at the time, I learned that was to be a pastor, that was a state religion, to be a pastor was a civil servant.
Yeah, pastors are civil servants in Germany.
And when did that start? Was that something that Hitler did?
No, it was
or
before Hitler.
Before that?
Yeah,
So they
Hitler
easily-
co-opted. He
Easily.
co-opted the Landeskirche. Yeah, and there were pastors who wore brown shirts, and there were theologians who aligned themselves with Hitler. I've got a book by a theologian named Paul Althaus, who wrote an eschatology, but he was a brown shirt, basically.
I think, if you weren't there, I mean, I hear this and I think, I have no idea what I would do.
No.
You know, unless you're in that situation.
Yeah, well, that's why we learn from history, right? What are the signs, what are the pressures? Why is it important to have a cohesive congregation that identifies itself as disciples of Jesus Christ? You know, so we come right down to that. What does it mean for the life of this church? Yeah.
I'd like to pay tribute to Bonhoeffer as not being a weak hippie, but he was a man of prayer, of strong faith, and he was always listening to what he called the Cantus Firmus, the profound, deep song of faith. And from prison he wrote this prayer: in my sleep he watches, yearning, and restores my soul, so that each recurring morning love and goodness make me whole. Were God not there, God's face not near, he had not led me out of fear. All things have their time and sphere. God's love lasts forever. This is Bonhoeffer praying from prison.
Yeah. Thank you, Rachel. And Bonhoeffer was definitely a man of prayer, reflection, contemplation, and he invited other people into that experience with him. And he's no hippie. Hardly. But he was, I suppose you'd call him a prayer warrior. Anyway. So, and then Monday the 7th, 2 days before, we'll have an evening discussion, talk about the film and maybe some other quotes from Bonhoeffer to the timeline. So, I realize time is precious. We appreciate your being here today. If you can come this afternoon and watch, that'd be great to share that experience with you as well. Thank you.